I'd now like to call on the first speaker of the proposition to begin the debate. Thank you. Let's call upon Ashwin.
Hi, can I be heard? Great. Okay. Preferred pronouns are they/them. I'll be taking POIs verbally. So just unmute yourself and ask. I will not be checking the chat. Panel, our world right now is one of slow discourse and slow progress because the way through which we achieve that progress is not rational and is illogical. We live in a world where public discourse is based in an appeal to emotion that is unsuccessful and unhelpful in achieving social progress. Our burden in this debate is to prove to you that we improve public discourse. Three pieces of sort of operational words before our counterfactual. What do we mean in this debate when we're talking about strong emotion? We're talking about emotions that are exclusive from logical rigor because they are emotions that enact an immediate desire to act in the moment instead of looking at an issue objectively and dispassionately. What do we mean by dispassionate objectivity and appeals to logic? We're talking about things like a focus on evidence and statistics, but also an analysis of causal factors that lead to an issue happening. Crucially here, recognize that logic is something that is common to everyone, whereas emotion is something that is subjective from person to person. When we're talking about public discourse, we're talking about politics, social movements, etc. But crucially, public discourse is what sets the trends for how people behave because it's a signaling mechanism for behavior. I'm going to move into our counterfactual now, and I want you to use your imagination. Because recognize that this debate obviously exists in a world where on both sides a trade-off exists between logical discourse and emotional discourse. We prefer a world where from the beginning of time, the way public discourse occurred was logical. Two things here. One, it would mean that public discourse shifted towards being policy and impact oriented. And two, the analysis of causal factors and systemic issues rather than a broad appeal to emotion is what pushes social movements. Crucially, on both sides of this debate, things like basic moral minimums, like empathy obviously exist. Those things aren't exclusive to emotions. So the idea of I must help the poor is a moral factor that is not emotionally driven. Okay. First argument now as to why on our side we increase the quality of public discourse. First thing I want you to recognize here is the nature of emotion and the fact that as human beings, we don't have control over our emotions because we may try to have control over our emotions, but fundamentally your emotions are not something that you can change or affect because your emotions exclusively or fundamentally exist in response to outside factors. Contrast that with something like logic, which is entirely in your control because you have to prove or disprove your ideas. Three mechanisms then here. Firstly, the fact that appeals to logic are more objective and thus better able to be communicated. That is to say that logic is more communicable. Why is this true? Because logic is something that everyone can understand. Recognize there's a difference between logic and complexity. Sure, not everyone may be able to understand complexity, but logic is the process by which you come to ideas, and that process is common to everyone in society. Contrast that with emotion, which is not easily communicable because there are structural barriers that prevent that emotion from being communicated. Things like racism, a lack of shared experience with other individuals, etc. That means you can't relate to that. So on our world, you are less able to dismiss ideas at face because you can't claim things like overreaction. You actually have to deal with the issues in logic that that idea has. But second, it actually becomes harder to criticize systemic issues because things like anger, which drive social movements in their side, require a discrete aggressor because the way human beings focus emotion is based on past experiences. Crucially, your past experiences are not with abstract ideas of systems, but with individual people or groups of people. This means that it is harder to break down systemic factors because you target the wrong individuals. You target the people that tend to be the result of an issue rather than the cause of the issue. For example, you target Trump as the issue for social like unrest and racism instead of the systemic racism that led to Trump being a problem in the first place. But third, you hurt social movements on their side because recognize that strong emotion instills in people an immediate need to act. The issue is that emotions are short term. What is the problem there? It means that emotions are exhausting. Because if any of you have been angry before, it's really hard to maintain that anger. This creates short bursts of action that are simply not effective. Because in order for a social movement to create change, you need to have constant pressure, or else what governments can do, like they do in status quo, is give band-aid solutions to appease emotion in the short term and don't have to follow through on promises. Contrast that to our side, where because you base your ideas on logic, there is not something that ebbs and flows, there is something that is constant that you're able to use to keep constant pressure. But lastly, on their world, there's an simplification of issues, because in order to convey emotion, you have to drown out the nuance in ideas and can't convey all the complexity present within them. What does this mean? It means that even good ideas in their world are easier to criticize and harder to believe, which means that even good ideas don't get the necessary traction they deserve to create social change. The second argument now is going to prove to you why we improve politics in specific. First thing I want you to recognize here is how politics functions because of things like social discourse. And that is to say, the way through which individuals engage with politics is through the medium of discourse. So if discourse itself is emotional, the way in which people engage with politics is emotional. If discourse is logical, the way in which people engage with politics is logical. Considering this, you're less able to do things like hold politicians accountable on their side. Because in a world where politicians campaign on the basis of emotion, as I've said, that comes in peaks and troughs. What does that mean? It means that in order to dissipate an emotion, you make promises to get votes, but comparatively, on our side, you actually have to follow through on those to actually keep those voters. Because they don't actually vote based on their emotion, they vote based on the likelihood of you actually implementing those policies. When you feel a huge pang of emotion, you're not thinking about, oh, will this actually solve systemic policing issues? You're thinking, does this policy solve policing? That idea of does it solve policing is not nuanced to actually understand the factors that create issues with policing. That is the issue on their side of accountability. But secondly, it's much easier for things like populism to take hold on-site opposition. Because recognize that when discourse in politics is based on emotion, it's very easy to appeal to a deep-set irrationality within your voter base. What does this mean? It means that populists can very easily target minorities by saying things like Mexicans are taking your jobs, even if that is not statistically or empirically true. What does this lead to? It leads to a form of scapegoating where you blame a group of people for a deep-set issue. So you blame Mexicans instead of blaming the capitalistic institutions' problems with boom and bust economic cycles. This means that on our world, there's a higher burden on politicians to actually prove their position because they are not taken as legitimate if their policies are not backed up by evidentiality, if they don't back up their policy by actually proving it. But lastly, what their side does is pull political discussion into the populist gutter. Because in opposition's world, the emotion is the focus and you can't be rational. Discourse gets worse and worse because of a negative feedback loop of emotion that you have to hop onto. Comparatively, on our world, emotional ideas don't gain traction in the first place because the people that espouse them aren't considered to be legitimate. Because we create change and we create better politics and we create better discourse proposed.
Thank you very much, Ashwin. I'd now like to call on the first speaker of the opposition, Tajay, to continue, rather to commence his team's argument.
Sorry, is this okay? Can you hear me? Thank you. The case of the proposition is that it is bad for people to make judgments on the basis of emotion. This is a separate debate. The question here is, in light of how people do make judgments, what should the public sphere reflect? And with that, we are proud to oppose. What do we support? We support a world where expressions of and appeals to emotion are preferred to dispassionate objectivity in the public sphere, although of course that doesn't mean dispassionate objectivity disappears. Crucially, proposition does not have the power to radically alter human psychology in their world. While rational discourse will be dominant in the public sphere, it does not mean that people will relinquish emotion in favor of logic in their own decision-making. Their decisions are still influenced by emotions they feel in the private sphere. Why is this true? This is because what happens in the public sphere does not automatically translate into personal thought. For example, we have a norm in most developed societies that we should treat politicians with civility when we are in public. This does not mean all of us think of the political other in a civil manner in our private thoughts or in our personal judgments. Clearly, therefore, proposition doesn't have the power to say that this extends into what people feel. Three arguments on that. First, no, thank you. First, on representation. Second, on mobilizing social change. And third, on how proposition dignifies unacceptable positions. Let's first look at the two false pieces of characterization from the prop. They first tell us that emotion means you have to act immediately. This is an assertion. Many emotions are long burning. For example, the intense anger at the apartheid system in South Africa burned over many decades and motivated a social change on a societal level. This is an untrue assertion. Second, they say that moral minimums and emotions can exist on both sides. Why is that true? Even if there is empathy in the world of proposition, it will be castigated as irrational. It is irrational for politicians to focus on emotions because it's not objective, and it is not something that we ought to focus on in the world of proposition. They cannot have that. First argument they have is that emotions are out of your control. This is not true because emotions are what you are. The basis on which you make judgments is your emotions, and it is illogical, therefore, to say that emotions are not what you are. But second of all, logic is equally bad. No, thank you. Because your logical judgments are equally subject to cognitive biases. Things like hyperbolic discounting, for instance, where you discount future costs, is a core part of the way in which we see things logically, and therefore this applies on their side as well. Second, they talk about communicability. I would argue that it's far worse on their side, because your ability to exercise logical, rational discourse is something that comes with a high level of education and privilege. For example, your ability to consider complex arguments, the way in which they interact, and for example, look at statistics and their implications on the real world requires a moderately high level of education, which not everyone can access. In contrast, emotions are universal. The feeling of anger that is felt by someone who is economically dislocated is the same as the anger that is felt by someone who suffers, for example, from structural racism. And that common humanity we can appeal to means that emotions are more communicable. Second, they say that emotions are targeted at people, not systems. This is an assertion. Why can't anger be targeted at the lack of anti-discrimination laws rather than specific people who have implemented them? Even if this is true, they haven't really proven why it's a harm, given that we vote out unjust politicians. Next, they say, well, we have short-term actions and policies. Again, this is an assertion. I proved to you at the start why long-term anger can exist. It doesn't mean you have to feel anger 24/7, but you know that something is unjust, and you feel an anger at the back of your mind on an everyday basis that motivates you to take action against this, and I'll clash further in my second argument. Moreover, I would suggest that if politicians don't live up to their promises, there will be a significant amount of anger directed at them, which is something that our proposition has failed to address. Finally, they say there is misrepresentation, and this leads to right-wing populism. On the argument of misrepresentation, actually, this is an important concession because it concedes that logic is complex, and that is why they think that emotions are very simplistic. But even on those grounds, logic can very, very easily be misrepresented. Look at the number of quote-unquote scientific racists, for example, who regularly manipulate, for example, educational data to quote-unquote prove that minority races are less less educationally invested. Hold on a moment. This exists equally on their side when there is misrepresentation. Finally, when it comes to right-wing populism, I think a comparative is not better on their side, because in certain cases, the logical data backs up these right-wing populist schemes. It is true, for instance, that immigrant workers compete with local workers for jobs, and that is the comparative on their side. We need to appeal to common humanity to argue for the rights and interests of these workers in the world of opposition. These concerns, therefore, are unjustified. Moving then to our first argument on increasing access to public discourse. The thesis is that appeals to emotion are necessary to allow individuals who suffer injustice to participate in the public sphere. I think the first premise of this is quite intuitive. Many individuals have good cause to feel strong emotions. If you're the victim, for example, of structural racism, of daily inequity, or the kinds of genocidal policies that exist in many regimes around the world, it is quite justified for you to feel a strong sense of emotion and anger at this. The second premise is more important. It is impossible, or unjustified to censor these emotive experiences from the public sphere. Often, this is impossible. it is impossible to get someone who suffered at the hands of a genocidal regime to keep those emotions down when they're just. This is important. I'll take the point.
Regardless of other factors, do you concede on your side that emotions are irrational?
Yes, but irrational is not necessarily bad. There are many things which are irrational. For example, caring for your friends and family members is irrational, because why should you treat them better than you treat every other individual in society? But the fact that these things are irrational judgments does not make them bad, because we are human, as humans are emotional creatures, and therefore our value judgments are emotional ones. So back to my case. First, it is impossible to censor these emotions. But second, even if it is possible, it is unjustified to do so. It is an excessive burden that we place on individuals who go through emotive experiences that in order to participate in public discourse, they have to keep those emotions down and censor them. Why is it that someone who, for example, went through sexual assault should not be allowed to emotively discuss that experience when she testifies in front of Parliament? It is unequal treatment that proposition is standing for. Finally, if individuals do this, then they are viewed as irrational in the world of proposition. When there is a social norm of objectivity, then social movements that are not objective, for example, Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter, are merely castigated as angry and cut out of public discourse. I've therefore proven that emotional appeals guarantee that the most disprivileged can actually participate in public discourse, which proposition can never have through their ivory tower logic. Second argument then, on motivating interest in social issues and public affairs. The premise of this argument is the public is disinterested in dispassionate objectivity. First, because often they don't feel the urgency or need for these causes in the world of proposition. If you are merely listing statistics about a certain cause or describing it in dispassionate terms, then you cannot convey the kind of need or urgency that these causes have, because this urgency only comes when you directly see the emotional appeal of these things and why they need to be acted on right now. Importantly, desensitization is unlikely to occur for two reasons. First, we can appeal to many different types of emotions, for example, anger or sadness or a sense of indignance. And therefore, social movements can vary what they appeal to compared to the one line of logic in the world of proposition. Second, there are different ways to appeal to these emotions. There's an infinite number of ways, for example, to appeal to anger, because you can tell different stories, reveal different perspectives, and continue to motivate anger. The upshot of this is that these things in our world increase public attention on social issues, especially because there is limited time and attention to really consider the kinds of complex logical arguments that proposition is trying to forward. Emotive appeals are often much more direct and take far less time to convey, which is why people are more likely to buy into them. The upshot of this is that there is more participation and support for important social issues on our side. Even if there is participation on their side, it is largely uncommitted participation, where people don't really see the need to make sacrifices or really put effort towards fighting for these causes. That is why social movements are actually bettered on our side of the house, and for that reason, we support open democracy over closed technocracy. We are proud to oppose.
I'd like now to call upon Chanidu to continue the proposition argument.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Great, just give me a second.
No problems.
When it was convenient for them, anger in public discourse was long burning. It does not create an immediate need to act, but is rather focused on broad systems and only materializes in the long term. But on the other hand, anger creates urgency, an immediate need to act that we cannot apparently create with logic. I think what opposition is doing is cherry picking examples of where emotions work in their favor and being excessively dismissive of the logical analysis that we gave you in our first speech about the inalienable characteristics of emotion. Recognize how dismissive many of their first speakers' responses are. Anger isn't this way. It's long burning. Anger doesn't mean that it has to dissipate over time. Anger can sometimes be rational. This does not engage with the analysis that we provided to you in our first speech, which was that in a world where we prioritize anger as the medium of public discourse that is a signaling effect on individuals, which means that perhaps in a very nuanced world where you can balance these trends perfectly, opposition's case might be valid, but they need to defend a status quo in a world in which emotional rhetoric is the majority of public discourse, not where it is one among many other forces. I don't think a lot of their analysis that goes both ways is applicable. I'm going to answer 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, effectivity in public discourse and which side increases it. Secondly, increasing political participation. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about increasing accountability within politics. I'll take you later. First, and I want to bring back the framing that we gave you in our first speech because their first speaker seems to mischaracterize it. They say that this debate doesn't change the emotional tendencies of individuals. This response is entirely hyperbolic because that was never our argument to begin with. Our argument was that people may have emotional tendencies on both sides of the house, but narratives surrounding public discourse act as a signaling mechanism that means that many individuals change the way that they behave in public. So access to things like logic and statistics, for example, is what feeds into the decision-making calculus of individuals. They take norms, like they very correctly pointed out to you, from politicians and the way in which they believe. I would argue that the reason as to why individuals opt into using emotional rhetoric is because there's a severe deficit of objectivity and rationality in public discourse currently, so they see this as the only alternative. Second clarification that I wanted to make was that our argument was that moral minimums are largely symmetric and will exist on both sides of the house. Why is this the case? It's often because logic does not exist in a vacuum. It is only meaningful when it is characterized among the values that we already hold. So logically, somebody might be able to argue something like eugenics or apartheid, for example, but we would still be able to reject that on our side of the house because we can appeal to the basic moral intuitions of individuals that exist independent of emotion. So I think many of their accusations that we cannot do those things on our side of the house simply fall. What else did they tell you in response? They told you anger was not long burning, that apartheid was an example of this. But what they failed to recognize is the analysis that we gave you. Because while perhaps you can have limited instances that anger flares up, that in the long term, it only manifests in peaks and troughs because anger is exhausting to individuals. For many individuals, there are many other priorities in their lives. And even if they are generally angry, they are angry at different things at different points in time. What does this mean for political discourse and accountability in particular? It means that politicians can exploit the fact that there are peaks and troughs to their benefit. Many election campaigns rely on stirring up deep emotions among individuals in the immediate build-up to an election and then allowing those emotions to dissipate, which allows politicians not to take accountability for the promises that they hold. This third argument that they make here was a rather strange one, which is that you are justified in feeling angry. I think this argument is as equally relevant to the debate as the accusations that they make against us. Because this argument is not about what is just in public discourse, it is about what is preferable in public discourse. Notably, we do not have to censor these individuals because we can still facilitate their emotions in internal forums. This is about outreach. It's about what social movements use when they're communicating to other platforms. They need to prove why the need for catharsis is so imminent and desirable that it can only be fulfilled in attempts for outreach. But secondly, I think that this is a deeply elitist argument because it tells you the only way that victims can gain meaning is through displaying emotional experiences in the most extreme ways possible. But think about the most vulnerable victims. These are probably individuals who cannot afford to take into account extreme emotions because they are to this day vulnerable. This looks like a black trans woman, for example, who cannot be angry at her oppressors even though she wants to because she knows that her house is going to be stoned if she speaks out angrily in public discourse. Notably, they cannot guarantee the safety of these individuals. So what does that mean for these people? It means the threshold that you set for what is necessary to participate in public discourse becomes displaying these kinds of extreme emotions. This means that you relegate politics to the room of the elites, those individuals who feel safe in displaying these extreme emotions. Second question on increasing political participation. And here's where we hear the second deeply elitist argument, that your level of education often means that you are unable to follow these logical links and gaps. I would argue that that is probably a product of the current system, where the focus on emotional rhetoric means that the incentive for individuals to politically educate themselves has dissipated over time. In our world, where from the beginning this was the norm that you created, we think that more and more individuals will probably be used to a political discourse that is focused on objectivity, logic, and rationality. So I think people are going to be more oriented towards those things on their side of the house. But secondly, they say that racists can manipulate information. but that already exists and likely will exist on their side of the house. It simply exists in smaller forums along extremists who are more likely to believe those things. When we bring these things to the fore, we are more able to criticize things like statistics, for example, that conflate race with IQ, because they are in fact statistically inaccurate in the vast majority of instances. So on their side of the house, this information still exists. It just exists in smaller forums and convinces those individuals. We bring it to the fore and increase the scrutiny that exists on it. Third question that I'm going to answer on increasing accountability. They say that sometimes in populism, statistics align with what is true. If that is the case, we're probably fine with that kind of political rhetoric. They ignore the nuance of the analysis that we gave you in our first speech, which was that we think that we ought to increase the burden that politicians have when they use emotional rhetoric to justify their policy. Because you can now no longer say Mexicans are rapists if you do not have hard facts to be able to back those things up. Perhaps emotional or even some sort of rhetoric will exist on our side of the house, but the burden on politicians to prove that what they are saying is true and not simply appealing to the base emotions of individuals disappears. Secondly, they say that we can't convey urgency on our side of the house. I would argue that many of the ways in which they convey urgency through the variations in emotions can also happen on our side of the house. So variations in the approach that you take towards logical rigorousness, who it benefits, the various causal factors that lead to something. These are all things that can spur objectivity among individuals. But secondly, they alienate the politically apathetic. The vast majority of these individuals believes that politics has become too extreme and emotional, that rational discourse has no place in it. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
On the one hand, you say that people who suffer deep injustice can simply talk about that in private or amongst themselves. On the other hand, you say that logic has a signaling effect, which means that people will be logical in their private discussions. Which of them is true?
It has a signaling effect in how they engage in public discourse. We can still facilitate the suffering of victims in internal forums in the vast majority of instances. You also ignore the analysis that the most vulnerable victims probably can't display these emotions, and you set an unfair trend on these individuals. Finally, I'm going to integrate some substantive material, because how is it that on their side of the house, they reduce political participation? The most apathetic in the vast majority of instances become disengaged with politics on their side of the house, because even though they know that they can vote rationally and objectively, they believe that the rest of the political spectrum is largely one that is dictated by emotions. This feeds into an existing collective action problem, where you believe that your vote is going to have a minimal impact on the overall election. In our world, where the norm is one of objectivity, you are more likely to believe that others are going to vote in objective and rational ways, which in and of itself becomes a rational incentive to vote yourself as well. For all of these reasons, I have never been prouder to propose.
I'd now like to call upon the second speaker of the opposition. Let's welcome Harit to continue his team's argument.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Sorry, is it better now?
Yes, so we're just echoing just at the beginning there. It seems to have settled down now. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I want you to listen to the language of the second proposition speaker. He tells us there are independent moral intuitions that exist regardless of your emotions. I want to know, what exactly are these moral intuitions? Down the line, they've never given us a single reason for how you can logically persuade someone that structural racism is bad and that it exists. They never give us a logical reason on how these arguments would look like, about how exactly they could persuade people that sexism is just logically bad. We told you from the beginning of this debate, the best offense against offensive ideologies is to tell people and to handle to their emotions by telling them that this is something that is terrible. On their side of the house, they haven't given us a single example of what exactly these arguments look like. That's disingenuous characterization, and they can't win the debate on that.
two questions. One, on accessibility of discourse, and two, on quality of discourse. First, on the accessibility of discourse. The cardinal sin made by this proposition team is the assumption they make that people suddenly magically transition into cold, rational individuals who don't feel emotion under their side of the house. And I want you to note the very contradictory responses we hear here. The first thing they tell us is that logic has a signaling effect, which means after a while, everyone becomes logical. Look, this contradicts the later response they give us about how people can just vent their emotions in private spaces. If what they tell us is true initially about how logic just suddenly makes people more logical, why exactly does their response on people being emotional in private settings stands? They need to choose what their characterization is. Are people logical on their side of the house, or are they emotional? Compare this to the consistency of our side of the house. We told you, emotions are a primordial human experience. This is something that every single human being faces because of something like human biology, where we've been fine-tuned to have emotional reactions, because of our guttural moral instincts that tell us that something is right and something is wrong. We told you that under their side of the house, emotion wouldn't disappear. However, the problem was the fact that the public stigmatizes against emotion necessarily means that you exclude a vast majority of people from public discourse, where they no longer feel welcome, because every single time they try to voice their opinion, people are telling them, you're not being rational, you're just too emotional, you're not thinking straight. We tell you they exclude a vast majority of people from public discourse. The only response we hear is honestly quite minimal. They tell us that, well, presumably, doesn't it just mean that under your side of the house, it's going to be a lot of backlash? They tell us minorities are going to look very aggressive on your side of the house. No, thank you. No. You know why minorities who are being emotional won't look aggressive under our side? Because emotion is a norm. At the point where emotional discourse and emotional discussions become the norm in public discourse, this is why they won't look emotional. I suspect a black mother telling people about her life experience, about how she was disenfranchised precisely because of structural racism that exists. I suspect these are individuals who look out of place on their side when people call them irrational. So no, minorities are benefited under our side of the house. Look, we told you two things. The first is that it's structurally impossible for these people to hide their emotions because of just how strong their disenfranchisement is. They tell us people can just hide them. They can just be more rational. No, I suspect people who have been oppressed for the longest time, a black mother who has lost her child to police brutality, she cannot just suppress her emotions and shut them off one day. That's not how this works. We tell you that's a disingenuous comparative they laid out for us. No. The second thing we told you was that it's unfair for us to make these minorities do this. After these individuals have been oppressed for so long, why is it fair for us to tell them, now you can't act on the basis of emotion? We're denying the fact that you have lived experiences. Why is it that it's okay for them to do that on their side of the house? No. Why is this incredibly important, and why does this win us the debate? The first reason this wins us the debate, even on their best case benefits of making politics better, is that there are fewer people involved in democracy in their world. Why? Because people don't feel welcome in public discourse anymore. A vast majority of people go completely unrepresented on their side of the house, when a vast majority of people, normal people like you and me, go completely unrepresented. That's the first issue. So even if it's true that politics becomes a bit better, I suspect this is a politics for the elite, the politics for the few who are able to access logic. They tell us here, but logic is something everyone can access. We told you, often complex philosophical arguments about why something is okay and why something isn't okay. These are often things that are only accessible to the privileged few who have had the ability to do things like receive an education, who have had the privilege of being exposed to these things. The vast majority of working class individuals, the poorest people in the Rust Belt, I suspect they are not individuals who have access to this. So on that side of the house, even if politics becomes more sanitized, this is sanitization for the elite. They just result in a lot of people going completely unrepresented. No. Second question on the quality of discourse. The main rebuttal we hear here is that they tell us on your side of the house, that discourse is just going to be bad because they tell us these things are very short-term. Emotions are short-term and exhausting. One, I suspect that to tell people who have been disenfranchised that one day they just feel it's very tiring to feel angry, that one day they just stop feeling emotions of anger at the fact they've been disenfranchised. That's insulting. These emotions of being disenfranchised, these emotions of anger and upset, they don't just vanish overnight. So that's just not true. That's the key response they've given us out of this debate. The last thing they tell us is this claim about how people are just going to magically learn logic. No. We've told them in a vast majority of cases, this is just not possible because of structural issues. I'm not going to deal with the final claim they made, which is that objectively speaking, there's a good outcome. This is the premise of the entire case. They've been telling us that there are just some pieces of information that are very important. It's important that we listen to things like statistics. The premise here is that statistics are sufficiently able to represent everything that we need to know. I suspect this is not true. Often, things like statistics paint a very incomplete picture because they've been maligned. We told you, statistics can be manipulated. You can portray a very specific picture. We told you about right-wing think tanks who often do things like say, often systemic racism doesn't exist. Just look at the numbers and the evidence. We told you the problem is that there's no objectively good outcome. Comparatively, it's far better that on our side of the house, we have things like emotion, because these paint a far more complete picture of what's happening. On our side of the house, people actually understand the lived experiences of how policies interact with people on the ground, not just numbers that don't tell you what's actually happening. So no, the quality of discourse also improves on our side. I'm going to clash even more with that case by talking about how their side dignifies immoral perspectives. Let's start with a very intuitive question. Do unsavory ideologies exist in their world? I'll take you in a moment. The question is yes. Often there are going to be people who believe horrible ideologies about things like how often Nazism is okay, about how white supremacy is okay. This is something that they have to stand for. Before I go on to explain why this problem is exacerbated, I'll take your point.
On your side of the house, you say that complex logic is required in order to justify many of our moral beliefs. How then on your side of the house do people have these moral intuitions if logic is inaccessible to them?
Our point is that under our side of the house, we don't rely on logic to inform people of moral intuitions. We rely on the emotions they feel by telling them that racism is bad because this person is just like you and you ought not to treat them any different because they just have the same feelings as you as well. So that's out of the debate. What is the problem, therefore, in their world? On their world, this argument is going to identify that a world of dispassionate objectivity legitimizes racists and bigots that both sides deplore. Why? Because you allow these individuals to present themselves as reasonable. Just think about cult personalities like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. These are people who do stand for bigoted things, like expelling LGBTQ minorities from society. The reason it's very difficult to delegitimize these individuals and call them immoral is because they claim to be logical. They claim to be reasonable. They claim to be people who stand for something that all of us would stand for on the basis of just logic and facts. No, this means that these individuals get very difficult to take down because every time a minority says this person is racist, they are dismissed in society by saying that this person isn't racist. He's using logic to enunciate a very nuanced opinion. No, these people are bigots, and that's why their side legitimizes them. On their side of the house, far more people are persuaded by these individuals simply because they appear more credible, because they appear more persuasive, because they appear more reasonable. I suspect people become very persuaded by these individuals, and more people become bigots. Our comparative is better because no, it might be true that we have some people who are bigots who use emotion. That is true. The distinction is that we can call them out. We can use our own intuitive appeals to emotion to say these people are horrible. Jordan Peterson, regardless of what logic he says, regardless of how legitimate he pretends to be, he stands for beliefs that are immoral and we ought to castigate him in society. This means that outside of the house, undignifying perspectives of how minorities ought to live their lives are expelled from society because it's far easier to castigate these individuals. For all of these reasons, we have proven that open democracy is preferable to closed technocracy. I am incredibly proud to oppose.
I now like to call upon the last substantive speaker for the proposition. Let's welcome Humaid.
Hi, am I audible? Am I visible? Great. Misogyny is bad because it takes away rights from women and discriminates them. There, I logically explained to Singapore why sexism is bad. Panel, if they don't understand that, I'm pretty concerned for them. I'm going to answer 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, what the characterization of emotions and logic is. Secondly, which side betters politics. But thirdly, which side betters long-term social change. First question then on characterization. Now, I want you to recognize that this is a unique motion. It is this house prefers the world in which motion. So what you need to do is imagine a world where from the beginning of time, we interacted with public discourse in a logical manner and compare that to status quo, where from the beginning of time, we have interacted with public discourse in an emotional way. That means that all the analysis Chanidu told you about internal forums for the minority of individuals who don't get used to logic over time are likely to be developed on our side of the house. They never really responded to that analysis, did they? They never responded to the idea that certain people can't afford to be angry in public because it comes at the cost of their safety and their lives. Panel, they need to deal with the analysis. They can't go on this rant and tangent in Op2 and expect them to win that the debate. But secondly, we think that logic and public discourse is a signaling mechanism to society and how they act. Because usually heads of social movements, etc., are the individuals you look up to as a person. Insofar as that signaling mechanism exists, it means in the vast majority of cases that if this is emotion that takes place from the start of time, people would get used to logic, people would get used to rationality. This is not a motion that happens today the moment we win this debate. It is emotion that takes place retrospectively. That is the unique analysis of this debate that they need to deal with. So where you break the tie is that we have a better comparative understanding of what this debate is like. Secondly, I'm going to deal with this issue that emotions are short-term or whether emotions are long-term and easy to understand. Firstly, panel, notice that from Prop 1 onwards, we gave you nuance, that this isn't a debate about public discourse being on complexity. This is a debate about public discourse being on logic. So over time, if politicians want to appeal to their constituents, they have the incentive to make that logic as simple and easy to understand as possible. Now, I understand that Singapore may not get all our analysis, but that's not the vast majority of people in this debate. They need to understand that this is a retrospective motion once again. The incentives of politicians and politics change over time to facilitate as many people into discourse, because that's what gets them into power. Secondly, this idea that emotions are short-termist. Look, they can't cherry pick examples like apartheid and say, oh, this wins us the debate. No, they need to deal with logic on a sound basis, because at the end of the day, to a vast majority of people, anger is an emotion you can't sustain. Sadness is an emotion you can't sustain because it eats you on a daily basis, panel. It's hard and it takes a rigor on your mental health and your day-to-day life. We think at the end of the day, what happens is people burn out and become fed up of public discourse. Because when politicians don't get anything done for them at the end of the day, which is analysis that Ashwin and Chanidu both gave you, that analysis burns people out and they get fed up. That is where you break the tie within this debate. That the incentives of people to engage with discourse diminish over time when that discourse is based on emotion. Therefore, they're more likely to make people apathetic towards public discourse in the long run. Proper opposition can't have it both ways, more importantly. They can't tell us emotions are long-termist and then tell us people have an urgency to act on emotions. They can't have their cake and eat it at the same time. So I think what we proved to you at the end of this clash is that we have a better understanding of this motion and the way emotions and logic work. Why is this massively important? Because the characterization of this debate is what bleeds down into every other clash that they're talking about. Every impact they can give us on the idea that minorities are isolated all come down to this one clash on characterization. And more importantly, the fact that they don't respond to some amazing analysis Chanidu gave you on how people are isolated because they're scared of their lives and people don't have the political capital to engage in anger means that they're losing out on this clash. Second clash then on politics. Now, I wanted to recognize it's very dim for them to tell us, oh, look, people are angry and therefore after politicians cheat them out of term, they're going to hold these politicians accountable. Panel, I'm not sure if they've heard the phrase of prevent, not cure, but that's what we're trying to do in the first place. We want to prevent those promises from being broken, because when people act on logic and rational emotion, which is a long-termist emotion panel, it means that they think about the likelihood and probability that those governments keep those promises. So we prevent those promises from being broken at the end of the day. But secondly, notice how they never really respond to Ashwin's analysis on how people think in the long term. They just want to give you examples in order to win this debate. Against the proposition that gave you analysis and logic, that's really not enough. Secondly, I'm going to flip that third argument on its heels. Panel, emotions are far more easy to manipulate than logic is. I can easily lie to Ashwin and tell him he's a great debater, even if he gives an average speech, and he will believe me because he's my friend. At the end of the day, panel, we think emotions are far more easy to manipulate because it is an irrational basis that people act on. Recognize, Tajay conceded to this in his first speech. He said that emotions are irrational, which means that it is far easier to manipulate those emotions in their world. So Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson can come and spew their bigotist ideas, and that is when people buy into them. And not importantly, in the status quo, people buy into those ideologies. That is not something they concede on their side of the house. It's too late for them to do that in Op 3. So I think we're able to prove to you that politics is able to manipulate individuals on the basis of emotions. Contrast this to when people think rationally and logically. That is when they can spew long-term change. That is when they're not voided by the emotions that politicians spew out. Ashwin gave you good analysis on populism, that hurts individuals because it leads into identity. At the end of the day, all they said was, oh no, look, people still believe populist ideas. Panel, if you cannot conclusively and statistically prove that people are rapists, it means that at the end of the day, these populist ideas that feed on minorities never take place on their side of the house. So there is a great incentive to deter those populist ideas because those politicians know that they will never be bought into. But secondly, even if populists come out there, there is a great likelihood that they will be rejected. Sure, existing bigots in society may buy into that analysis, but the vast majority of people on the fence who buy into that emotion in opposition's world don't buy into that emotion on our world. Third clash then on social change. Now, I think this is a fairly nebulous idea that they give you, that it's unjustified for us to force individuals of minorities into shells that they don't want to be in. They tell us, oh, look, it's unjustified. Firstly, never dealt with the characterization of the motion that this house prefers. But secondly, and very importantly, panel, we are more likely to facilitate social change and urgency on our side of the house. Because Chanithu gave you analysis on why individuals are less apathetic on our side because they feel like there is something for them in the political system. But secondly, in an absolute worst case scenario, sure, some people may be sad for a short period of time, even if we can't get those internal redressal mechanisms. What is more important is solving the structural issues that make them sad in the first place. I would rather be sad than always be sad all the time on their side of the house. So when social movements act on a rational basis, that's when they hit systems instead of people. They never really hit the analysis Ashwin gave you on focusing on individuals rather than systems. They just tell us, oh, look, why can't we focus on institutions? They need to deal with logic. But, oh, wait, they only have op 3 to do that. It's too late for them to win this debate. Propose.
I'd now like to call upon the last substantive speaker for the opposition. Let's welcome Caleb.
Testing, can everybody hear me? I'm going to ask two questions. One, which side upholds democracy? Two, which side ameliorates social change? One, on democracy. We began from the premise that there is no objectively correct decision. Given that their side allows people to vote, they agree with this premise. Therefore, the key metric in this debate is which side allows more people to participate in a democratic fashion, which was a decision that only our side was able to accrue. Under a system of dispassionate objectivity, people are turned away from the democratic process when people's experiences are not valued and when people do not get recognition for what they feel. Their side can change the discourse, and that is in the motion, but they do not have the ability to change how people think or how people feel. Do not let their side's previous speaker tell you that this is a retrospective, this house prefers motion, and as a result, they have the ambit to change human nature. They do not. The very fact is, they can only change the system in which people operate, but cannot change the instincts that people have. And this is something we told you since first, with the example of civility that they did not deal with. What then does this mean for their case? It means that the very fact that they have a signaling effect means that people are far less likely to speak out and to vote. The thing is, they have already conceded from first that logic is about things like statistics and research. And as a result, this has an extremely high bar of entry, something they have not responded to sufficiently. No, thank you. On their side, they tell that politicians will therefore try to inculcate logic in their voters. But I suspect that the converse is true, where they try to keep more people excluded from logic to ensure that they continue winning elections and ensuring that they still have success. Why then is this democratic exclusion the most important issue in this debate? Firstly, because when people are not engaged, we win on their very own metric. If their side is about achieving the objectively correct decision, it means weighing the experiences of different people. And when different people just do not speak out on their side, they cannot achieve that benefit at all. Secondly, their side locks people out of discourse, which means that discourse can be hijacked by a particular elite and the privileged few. Think about it. At a point at which it's the people who control the media and the politics to ensure that these people can get the benefits that they have, which is something they conceded in the previous speaker, then it means that the elite has control. Finally, we told you that this was a principled wrong because you act on people without their consent when they cannot participate in policy. Notice that this is the most important issue and path to victory in this debate, because we proved you that this harm was certain. Even if they tell you about how they affect social change in the long term, I think we have cast sufficient doubt on the ability to do so. And therefore, this debate must be about whether or not we represent more people. No, thank you. The only response we got towards this particular line was, there's backlash on our side. Firstly, I suspect this is symmetric on their side as well, given that people who come forward with their experiences or logic are simply dismissed for being illogical by the people who currently wield the power. I suspect that on our side, there is no sufficient backlash for us to completely question the nature of this. Their side's only other mechanism, which is internal forums, is disgusting. They are conceding that these people will not be part of the democratic process. They are conceding that experiences of sexual assault and racism should be kept secret, which I do not think is something that their side is willing to stomach. At the end of the day, if people are scared for their lives, I think that this is a decision that people ought to be able to make. The protester who chooses to put his life on the line to tell people the kind of systemic problems that he faces, I think this is something which people are justified to do. At the end of the day, they have not shown us why this backlash is something that is sufficient to win them this debate overall. No, thank you. I'm not going to deal with the subterranean that he used to try to attack our case. The idea that emotions are not objective cannot be trusted. I suspect that emotions do not have this feature because logic has it as well. Cognitive biases, for instance, a short-term bias, which means that oftentimes people cannot weigh things logically either. But a furthermore thing we told you is that simply because emotions are irrational does not mean that it's easy to manipulate. A Jamaican refugee in New York, for instance, probably has views about social welfare that you cannot change simply by manipulating their emotions. I think it's a very bleak nature of human nature that they're trying to promote on their side of the house. Therefore, what I've been able to show you thus far is that emotions are legitimate things to weigh in the democratic system, and this ensures democratic representation. This is the most important issue in the debate because the vast group of the working class falls under this clash. This I cannot simply tell us, as he did in the last speech, that they will be sad for a short period of time. This is disenchantment that lasts for millions of people for countless decades. I think that is something they cannot stomach. Second question then, on how we ameliorate social change. Before that, I'll take that point.
You concede that it's bad to exclude victims from discourse. There are certain victims who cannot be emotional because of a possibility of harm to their person. Why then is it just to exclude the most vulnerable forms of victimhood from the discourse you want to maintain?
The key here is that we provide choice. On our side, if a person has gone through a traumatic experience, they don't need to come forward. But on your side, you simply have no option of displaying indignance, anger, because otherwise they will be told you are irrational. You shouldn't even come out with this experience. Why are you trying to taint people and make people irrational? I suspect that on their side, all of those harms are worse. Second clash then, on how we ameliorate social change. The fact is that when people react in emotional ways, we advance society more quickly. We can appeal to common humanity, increase the urgency that people feel, and as a result, get that change. When on the comparative, they cannot. All they tried to tell us was that we can appeal to moral minimums. But I think that you simply cannot have moral minimums when you're trying to appeal to logic, and those things have to be justified. Think about it. In third proposition, when they try to convince us that everyone has rights, I don't think it's really as simple as that. Where do rights come from? What do they derive? I think that this is simply something that cannot just be asserted when in fact, many people have tried to do so before and have not succeeded. What then did they tell us? They tell us there's populism and this is irrational. 3 responses. Firstly, populism also occurs on their side when it's simply justified by facts and logic, which can be manipulated to support many of the noxious things that both sides disagree with. But secondly, I want to ask, how did populism occur? The reason populism occurs is because people go against the fundamental emotional needs of human nature. When in the past, in the 2000s, we resorted to a technocratic think tank way of doing democracy when in fact, people's experiences do matter. At the end of the day, there's likely to have one of an underground populism, where people simply express these emotions themselves or in their own communities without it coming out and being debated and discussed. Finally, as we have told you through all 3 speeches, we have the solution to populism. On our side, we can use emotion to call people out, prevent people like Donald Trump from hiding behind that veneer of legitimacy and appeal to higher ideals. I suspect that this is something that we win if they want to talk about populism. I think that alternative under their world cannot be simply one of people shifting towards the arc of justice in the long term. Simply because people are dispassionate does not mean that they disavow all their former racist views. Misrepresentation still occurs, racialism still disguises itself under statistics. On their side, we showed this was even worse in our second speaker argument because they legitimize those who have the ability to seem logical. Their side tries to respond by telling us they can continue to hide under emotions on our side. But the fact is, if an emotion is illegitimate, it's far easier to call it out, rather than simply relying on somebody who is an expert or an authoritarian, and as a result, you cannot question that person anymore. Finally, the last straw standing. Emotions come in short bursts. You cannot sustain durable change. This is not true. We told you it was offensive to suggest that the black person would suddenly forget about his oppression, that the woman suddenly forgets about the pain of never seeing her son again one morning. I think that at the end of the day, we do get durable change and people do not burn out at a point at which emotion is something we draw upon rather than something logical you saw in the newspaper the day before. At the end of the day, we create greater empathy, we create greater democracy. We prefer open democracy to a closed technocracy we're extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, everyone. We now come to the leader's reply. And I'd like to call back the first speaker of the opposition, Tajay, to conclude his team's argument.
Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Let's say that proposition achieves the social benefits that they seek. They mitigate populism, they make political decisions on the basis of truth, and they ensure that we make better objective decisions in the political sphere. Our contention was that this comes at a cost that we are not willing to bear, where individuals have to suppress their emotional experiences in order to participate in this acerbic public discourse. The only response from the entirety of the proposition bench to this argument we gave you in first is that minorities can't do this because there is backlash and they don't feel safe. We pointed out that this is an outcome of their world, when minorities are viewed as angry and irrational when they give voice to their emotional experiences, when there is a norm of only using dispassionate objectivity. But even if you buy that response, it's not enough, because we give people rights to do things even when it comes at a cost to themselves. For example, minorities expressing themselves in status quo might lead to some backlash. That's not enough to ban them from doing that because it is a right they ought to have. Third proposition callously dismisses this as some people feeling sad for a short amount of time. That is not enough. It is the crucial feeling of empowerment that minorities feel when they're able to give their thoughts in the public sphere and see that their experiences are being listened to, which the establishment has ignored for decades. Until proposition was able to give us a reason why it is justified to censor these experiences, they lose, and proposition reply is too late. Secondly, proposition also locks many ordinary people out of discourse because logic is highly inaccessible. We agree with proposition. This debate takes place from the beginning of time, but their mechanism that you gave you in third speaker was rather strange. Why do politicians have an incentive to educate people in logic and enfranchise more people? As we showed you in our third speech, it's more likely that they enfranchise very few people and therefore ensure that their elite policies continue to be passed. The result of this is that logic is highly inaccessible, whereas emotions are more accessible. And the reason is because emotions appeal to everything, so to something that we can all share, and on that basis, people can participate on our side. I want you to notice that in the world of proposition, therefore, a vast majority of people cannot participate in politics. And this is more important than all of these social outcomes proposition seeks to achieve. Because as I mentioned in my first speech, this is the basis on which we accord people the right to vote. Even though many people make bad decisions at the ballot box, they vote against their interests. They vote against their social interests. They act in irrational ways. We allow them to do that because we think the right to vote and the right to express yourself is more important than the outcomes of those decisions that you make. But let's engage on what proposition wanted to talk about. We pointed out that many things will exist in their world too. For example, populism can be equally justified on the basis of statistics and rational discourse. That was our second speaker argument. I want to note here that proposition is being conflationary. Rationality is not the same as truth. You can have statistics that allow you to believe in something on a rational basis. Those statistics, however, may not be true. And that is something I told you in first speaker, about how it's very easy to misrepresent these statistics. And that's why proposition doesn't secure any of the benefits they seek, because they're made on the basis that truthful claims only exist in their world. What is the comparative in the world of opposition? We ensure that more people participate in politics, which at the least fulfills our principled obligation to these people, but it also benefits individuals on the practical sense proposition wanted to talk about, because it means more people are going to be involved in important social movements, going to do, for example, do activist work, vote on these important social issues when they feel it is something of emotional importance. Note that the false dichotomy proposition pushed is just wrong. Why can't emotions be both urgent and long-term? These are not mutually exclusive characteristics, and hence emotions can guarantee that individuals do act in the short term, but also sustain this action far into the future. For that reason, even on proposition's metric of social change, we win by motivating people to participate in politics. For that reason, we believe that an open democracy is preferable to a closed technocracy. We are proud to oppose.
And to conclude the debate today, let's welcome back Shani Doom.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah, I'll take that as yes. Don't let opposition third speak and reply gaslight you into believing that a clash that never happened in this debate actually did. Because we never contended that we would want to ban individuals from voting, that we don't care about the participation of individuals. The claim that we made from first, and importantly that they did not respond to, was that on our side of the house, people can better align their own personal interests with what is happening in the political background in such a way that they're able to get outcomes that are beneficial for them. I thought it was deeply elitist of them to suggest that rationality and logic is something that is exclusive to the ruling elite. Because what do people exercise in their day-to-day lives when they're making decisions in their homes, in their lives, in their families? It is logic and rationality. And it is the same logic that they would very easily be able to apply to politics on our side of the house. So this debate was never about increasing democratic participation, because that was never something we were against. It was about facilitating better decision-making by giving individuals the information that would empower them to align their interests with what is going on in politics. Following from that, two questions. Firstly, on better decision-making, secondly, on social change. But very quickly, a clarification on moral intuitions. The assumption that we made here was quite simple, which is that there are probably some moral intuitions that exist both independent of logic and emotion that allow us to live in a human civilization. They said that these things rely on emotion to remain true, but that's factually untrue, right? Even if we have different responses to fascism, I think we can all agree that it is a fundamentally unjust policy because our moral intuitions lead us to believe so. Importantly, logic does not exist on a vacuum on our side of the house. But even if this was not true, we told you that logic was a better way to get to our moral intuitions than emotion was. Because emotions can be manipulated in such a way that you can gaslight people into believing things that are untrue because of their emotions, because you can manipulate them to believe that they have been wronged in instances where you cannot. Logic, we think, is more resistant to this manipulation. So the first question on better decision making. On our side of the house, we said that people become more rational due to the signaling effect from politicians. They say that they would just exclude them from logic, but that's not how politics works. Competing political parties probably have an interest to want to make their voters more logical and rational when that becomes the medium through which you engage with politics. Similarly, their benefits rely on emotion becoming the norm. So if they can claim this benefit, I think we can claim that logic becomes the norm on our side of the house. Secondly, they told you that we make people restrict emotions. This was an entirely hyperbolic argument. Our argument was never that we support censorship, but that there is a distinction between the strategy that we use in outreach, in election campaigns, in social media, for example, and what we can facilitate in internal forums. But secondly, they never responded to the nuance of the analysis that came from my speech and only got even a small response when we POI'd on them in op-third, which was that you now place a higher burden on victims. Because if you're not really battered and bruised, are you really a sexual assault victim? If you haven't washed up on the shore, are you really a refugee? On their side of the house, people need to be viscerally emotional in order to justify their lived experiences. The third speaker told you that it is easier to call out emotions. That is exactly the point. You can delegitimize these individuals' lived experiences on their side. Finally, they said that statistics are fallible on both sides. If that is true, statistics exist on both sides. We bring them to the fore and point out statistical inaccuracies that delegitimize things like the correlation with race and IQ. Finally, on social change, they said that you can have urgency and long-standing burnout on both sides of the house. This is just untrue. You can have one or the other. You can't pick both benefits. So I think on their side of the house, their strategy was to drop the argument on urgency and bring it up back in reply. That just doesn't work. But what was the missing engagement and what do they need to respond to? 3 ideas. Firstly, that scapegoating of minorities becomes more difficult because you cannot direct the anger of individuals to those who are not responsible for it. Secondly, a higher burden on politicians to justify the rhetoric that they use as opposed to conflating the rhetoric with the truth itself. But thirdly, a difficulty in criticizing systemic issues because there is no discrete aggressor at which to target these emotions. Finally, we told you that emotions are easier to manipulate because they only dealt with instances where emotions are used for the benefit of individuals. But what about right-wing populism that has consistently lied to individuals and told them that minorities are the reason for your suffering and used emotional rhetoric to use it? I think in a world that is more logically rigorous, we would be able to call out these individuals more effectively. For all of these reasons, side with side proposition.